He was fired for being too dark. The termination letter felt like a block of ice in his hands, its crisp edges sharp against his calloused palms. Outside the tinted glass of the downtown office building, the November sky over Buffalo was a flat, unforgiving gray, the color of wet pavement and forgotten things. His name was Marcus Washington. For 17 years, he had been a master craftsman, a finisher who could coax a soul out of a block of mahogany or a sheet of cold-rolled steel. He worked with his hands, and his hands were precise, patient, and strong. They knew the language of wood grain and the temper of metal. Now, those same hands were still, resting on the worn steering wheel of a 10-year-old Ford, parked in a lot that overlooked the skeletal remains of the city's industrial past. He was a finisher, and he had been finished. Marcus lived on the east side of Buffalo, New York, in a small second-floor apartment in the Fillmore-Leroy neighborhood. The place was as ordered as a monk's cell. His tools were cleaned and hung in perfect alignment on a pegboard in the spare room. The floors were swept, the single dish in the drying rack was spotless, and the bed was made with military corners. But the order was a cage for a stillness that had no peace in it. The air was thin and cold, holding the faint scent of lemon polish and a deeper metallic smell of nothing, of absence. Light from the single window was weak, a diluted wash that did little to disturb the long shadows in the corners. It was a room waiting for a life to begin, even though a man was sitting right in the middle of it. He would sit for hours in a straight-backed wooden chair he had built himself, watching the weak afternoon light crawl across the floorboards. He saw the city through that window, the steeple of a distant church, the brick facades of houses built a century ago, the bare branches of a sycamore scratching at the sky. It was his city, the place of his birth, but it felt alien now, a landscape seen through a thick, distorting glass. His own reflection in the darkening window was a stranger's, a silhouette whose edges were blurred, whose center was hollow. He had been told he was too dark, and the words had seeped into his world, staining the light itself. He remembered the office, a space of brushed nickel, blonde wood, and immense sheets of glass. It was designed to feel open and bright, a place where light was currency. His boss, a man named Henderson with a soft handshake and eyes that never quite met his, had called him in on a Tuesday. The blinds were drawn against the afternoon sun, casting tight parallel bars of light and shadow across the polished conference table, across Henderson's face, across the file with Marcus's name on it. Henderson slid the file an inch forward. He didn't open it. There was no mention of performance, of a missed deadline, of a single flaw in the 17 years of flawless work. The words were spoken softly, wrapped in the corporate jargon of downsizing and restructuring. But then came the stone, the single heavy thing that shattered the careful glass of the conversation. Henderson had leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a painful but necessary truth. "Look, Marcus," he'd said, steepling his fingers, "the partners feel, and our clients have given feedback, that your presence is just a little too dark for our forward-facing aesthetic." The word hung in the air-conditioned quiet. Dark. Not his work, which was impeccable. Not his attitude, which was professional. His presence. The simple, immutable fact of him. He remembered the drive home from that downtown office tower, past the grand dome of Buffalo City Hall, a monument to a civic pride he no longer felt. He remembered passing the Naval and Military Park, where the decommissioned warships sat silent and gray on the water, monuments to old conflicts. He felt like one of them, a vessel built for a purpose, now permanently docked, a relic. He had gone to St. Michael's Church once, years ago, for a funeral. He recalled the immense stained glass, filtering the light into 100 jeweled colors. But the memory brought no comfort. What good were colored windows when the light outside was gone? The wound was not a cut that could be stitched. It was an erasure, the feeling of being unseen and seen all at once, his work invisible, his skin a target. In his apartment, the silence was absolute. There was no radio, no television. Only the sound of his own breathing and the slow, heavy beat of a heart that had been told it was not fit to be seen. One afternoon, the stillness in his apartment became a physical pressure. He couldn't breathe. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the biting November air, with no destination. He just walked, his boots crunching on sidewalks salted against a frost that hadn't yet come. He walked east on Broadway, past the Broadway market with its neon signs dark in the daylight, past storefronts with iron gates pulled down. The sky was the color of lead, and a wind was picking up off Lake Erie, carrying the damp chill of deep water. His feet, moving with a will of their own, led him down streets he barely knew, into the heart of the old Polonia neighborhood. He stopped in front of Corpus Christi Church in Buffalo, New York. He had never been here before. It was a titan of brick and stone, with two soaring towers that seemed to hold up the heavy sky. In a small grotto to the side of the main entrance, nestled in a protective alcove of fieldstone, stood a life-sized statue of the Virgin Mary. She was carved from white marble, her hands open in a gesture of welcome or surrender. Her face, serene and sorrowful, was tilted slightly downward, her gaze directed at the frozen, barren rose bushes planted at her feet. Snow from a previous dusting clung to the folds of her robe. She was pristine, unmarked, a symbol of a purity and grace that felt like a personal accusation. Something inside him, a tightly coiled spring of weeks of silence and swallowed words, snapped. He saw the whiteness of the stone, the calm acceptance in her carved face, and all the unspoken weight in his chest ignited. He looked down. Beside the walkway was a patch of frozen mud where the grass had worn away. Without a single conscious thought, he bent down, his gloved fingers digging into the icy dirt, and clawed out a dark, heavy clod of earth. He stood up, his arm drawing back. The motion was fluid, primal. He threw it. The frozen mud arced through the cold air and struck the statue squarely on the chest. It didn't shatter. It smeared. A wet brown stain, ugly and stark, spread across the white marble heart of the Virgin. At that exact moment, 4:17 p.m., the heavy wooden door of the church opened with a groan. An old woman, her head covered in a floral babushka, stepped out. She saw Marcus. She saw the stain on the statue. Her gloved hand flew to her mouth, and a small, leather-bound prayer book slipped from her grasp, falling to the stone steps with a soft, final thud. The old woman didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stood there on the top step of Corpus Christi Church, her breath fogging in the cold, her eyes fixed on Marcus. In them he saw not alarm, not anger, but a deep, bottomless sorrow that was somehow worse than any accusation. It was the look of someone watching a tragedy they were powerless to stop. The silence that stretched between them was immense, broken only by the distant wail of a siren and the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the pavement. Her stillness was a judgment more profound than any shout. Marcus turned and fled. He didn't run. He walked, fast and clipped, his shoulders hunched against her gaze. He didn't look back. He walked for miles, his lungs burning with the frigid air, until he found himself on the sterile, brightly lit campus of the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus. He stood across from the sleek glass facade of the Gates Vascular Institute, watching ambulances slide into the bay with a silent, urgent grace. The whole world seemed to be moving on, tending to its wounds while he was stuck, the feeling of the cold, wet mud still on his fingertips. That night, he couldn't escape the image of the stain. From his apartment window, he could just see the twin spires of the church. He imagined he could see the grotto, the small dark mark against the white. The next day, he drove past. A small group of parishioners was gathered by the statue, speaking in hushed Polish and English. Someone had tried to clean it. He could see the scrub marks, but a faint, shadowy discoloration remained on the marble like a bruise. Later, at a small diner on Swan Street, he sat in a booth and listened. Two men in work jackets were talking about it. "Some punk," one said, shaking his head. "No respect?" Marcus felt the heat rise in his face. He paid for his coffee and left, the liquid still untouched. The stain was his, a secret signature he had left on the heart of the neighborhood. A week passed. The gray buffalo sky seemed to lower itself, pressing down on the city. A damp, persistent cold seeped through the window frames of Marcus's apartment and settled deep in his bones. He felt a constant, dull pressure in his chest, a physical weight that made each breath an effort. He tried to work, to lose himself in the familiar ritual of sanding a piece of reclaimed oak. But his hands, once so steady, now had a fine tremor. The wood felt alien, unresponsive. He set his tools down. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was full of a low, humming tension. He felt isolated, adrift in a city of 270,000 souls. He stopped answering his phone. His sister's calls went to voicemail, her worried messages piling up, unheard. He felt a feverish heat behind his eyes, though his skin was cool to the touch. Each night, sleep offered no escape. He would drift in a shallow, restless state, the image of the stained statue replaying in his mind, sharp and clear. It was always the same. The arc of the mud, the impact, the quiet thud of the prayer book on the stone. He was trapped in the moment of his own desecration. At 2:48 a.m. one morning, he woke up gasping, the pressure on his chest so intense he thought his ribs might crack. He stumbled to the window, pulling it open, and sucked in the freezing night air. The city below was asleep, its lights a scattered, indifferent constellation. He was utterly, completely alone. One night, something changed. Marcus was startled awake not by a sound, but by the lack of it. The constant, low-frequency hum of the city, the distant traffic on the Kensington Expressway, the buzz of streetlights, the rumble of the late-night freight train, had vanished. A profound and absolute silence had fallen over the neighborhood, a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. It was 3 a.m. The world outside his window was holding its breath. He rose from his bed and went to the window, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked out toward Corpus Christi Church. The grotto, usually lost in the shadows of the building, was bathed in a soft, internal luminescence. It wasn't a harsh electric light, but a gentle, pearlescent glow that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the statue itself. It pulsed with a quiet, steady rhythm, like a sleeping heart. As he watched, mesmerized, a scent drifted through the open window, carried on the frigid air. It was the unmistakable, impossible perfume of roses in full bloom. It was a smell of summer gardens, of life and warmth, and it had no place in the frozen heart of a Buffalo November. Down on the street below, a man named Stanislaw Kowalski was walking his small terrier. He lived in a house on Clark Street, directly adjacent to the church grounds. He stopped dead in his tracks, his dog whining softly at his feet. He stared at the grotto, at the unearthly light that seemed to turn the surrounding snow blue. He would later tell his wife, his voice trembling, that it looked like the moon had come down to rest in the church garden. At that precise moment, a sound broke the deep silence. A single resonant chime from the church bell tower. Not the frantic ringing for a service, but one clear, deep, solitary toll that vibrated through the glass of Marcus's window and settled deep within his chest, loosening the knot that had been strangling him for weeks. The first light of dawn was a pale, watery gray. The city's hum had returned, but the silence inside Marcus remained. The pressure in his chest was gone, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar calm. He knew, with a certainty that required no thought, what he had to do. He found a bucket, a bottle of gentle, biodegradable soap, and a set of soft cotton rags he kept for polishing wood. He filled the bucket with warm water from his tap and carried it out of his apartment, down the stairs, and into the cold morning. He walked the blocks to Corpus Christi Church. The grotto was no longer glowing, but a sense of profound stillness lingered in the air around it. The statue stood as it had before, but he saw it differently now. The faint brown stain on its chest was not just an act of vandalism, it was his own pain, given form and thrown outward. He set the bucket down. Then, on the cold, damp ground, still hard with the morning frost, Marcus knelt. He dipped a cloth into the warm water, squeezed it out, and gently touched it to the stained marble. He began to clean. He worked with the same patient precision he brought to his craft. His movements were slow, methodical, and reverent. He wasn't just scrubbing a stain, he was tending to a wound. He cleaned the smudge from her heart, his fingers tracing the gentle curve of the stone. He didn't stop there. He cleaned the entire statue, wiping away the accumulated grime of a long year. He washed the dust from the folds of her robe, the city soot from her serene face, the dried leaves from the crevices of her open hands. For over 2 hours he knelt there, the steam from his bucket rising like incense in the cold air, until the white marble gleamed, brighter and purer than he ever could have imagined. When he was finished, he took a single perfect white rose he had bought at a corner store and placed it at the statue's feet. As Marcus was carefully drying the last bit of moisture from the base of the statue, a figure approached. It was the old woman from the church steps. She moved slowly, her cane tapping a quiet rhythm on the sidewalk. She carried a large, steaming thermos. She stopped beside him, her eyes moving from his face to the immaculate, gleaming white marble. She looked at the single white rose at its feet. Her face, etched with the lines of a long life, softened. She said nothing. She simply unscrewed the cup from the top of the thermos, filled it with hot, dark coffee, and set it on the grotto's stone ledge beside him. She gave him a small, slow nod, then turned and continued on her way. This quiet act was the first stone cast in a different pond. A few days later, a group of teenagers who usually loitered across the street, smoking and leaving trash, were seen picking up discarded wrappers around the church grounds. One of them, a boy in a hooded sweatshirt, paused to look at the clean statue and the fresh flower someone had left there, his expression unreadable. An ambulance from American Medical Response, stationed nearby at their headquarters on William Street, pulled over for a moment. The paramedic in the passenger seat, a woman named Sarah who was worn down by a long shift, saw the shining grotto. She watched as a young man, Marcus, carefully swept the leaves from the walkway in front of it. Without knowing why, she bowed her head and whispered a prayer for a patient she had lost the day before, the first prayer she'd said in a decade. The change rippled outward from the small garden on Clark Street. People in the neighborhood started leaving flowers at the grotto, a few carnations, a clutch of daisies, another single rose. They didn't come in droves, but as a quiet, steady trickle. They would pause for a moment, their hands deep in their pockets against the cold, and look at the statue of the woman in white, now tended and cared for. The act of restoration had awakened something, a shared, unspoken need for a small patch of ground to be treated as sacred. The whispers in the diner on Swan Street changed. They were no longer about vandalism, but about the quiet man who came every morning to tend the grotto, no matter how cold it got. Marcus never returned to the world of corporate finishing, of brushed nickel and client-facing aesthetics. He found a new purpose right there, within the brick walls of Corpus Christi Church. He spoke with the parish priest, a kind elderly man named Father Michael, and offered his skills. He started with the main doors, a masterpiece of carved oak that had been dulled by a century of weather and wear. He spent a month stripping, sanding, and refinishing them, his hands sure and steady once more. He worked not for a paycheck, but for the deep satisfaction of the work itself, of bringing beauty and life back to something that had been neglected. After the doors, he moved inside, restoring the intricate woodwork of the pews, mending the cracked frame of a baptismal font, polishing the worn communion rail until it shone with a deep, warm luster. His presence became a quiet fixture in the old church. He worked in silence, the scent of linseed oil and wood polish mingling with the faint, lingering smell of incense. He had found his place, not in being seen, but in seeing what needed to be mended. Father Michael often told the story of a young couple from the parish. Their marriage strained to the breaking point. They had been arguing on their way to counseling when they saw Marcus on his knees, carefully weeding the frozen garden around the grotto. The sight of his quiet, patient care for something so small stopped their fight. They stood and watched him for a long time, and then, without a word, took each other's hands and went home. They said later that it was the first act of grace they had shared in years. A mark of shame, thrown in a moment of pain, can become a site of healing. A wound, when tended with reverence, can be the source of a grace that ripples out into the world, touching lives in ways we can never predict. The darkness we feel, the darkness we are told we carry, is not the end of the story. It is often the very thing that leads us to the light, not by erasing the shadow, but by teaching us where to place our hands to begin the work of restoration. True value is not in a forward-facing aesthetic, but in the quiet, humble, and often unseen labor of mending what is broken. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.